New York City. The five families ruled organized crime across America with iron discipline. At the center of power sat Don Vito Corleone, the aging patriarch who had built the Corleone empire through patience, intelligence, and a reputation for keeping his word. For decades, Vito had maintained peace through the Commission, a governing council of all major crime bosses who settled disputes and divided territory without constant warfare. But across the city, Don Emilio Barzini was growing impatient with the old order. Barzini controlled tremendous resources and commanded loyalty from multiple families. He looked at Vito, now in his 60s, growing frail, spending more time in his garden than in the streets, and saw opportunity. The old man was finished, Barzini believed. The Corleone family was vulnerable. In 1945, Barzini began his move. He approached Sollozzo, a drug trafficker looking for family protection to expand narcotics operations across America. "I'll introduce you to the Corleones," Barzini promised. But this was no innocent business proposal. Barzini had calculated everything. He knew Vito would refuse the drug trade. It violated his principles. He knew Vito's hot-headed oldest son, Sonny, would explode with an anger at the insult. And he knew that once the Corleone family fractured in internal conflict, Barzini could move against Vito directly. Barzini gathered the other families, the Tattaglias, the Quenzas, the San Clementis, building a coalition. He spread the word through commission circles. The Corleone era is ending. Vito cannot hold his own sons in line. The family is weakening. When the moment comes, we strike. In the presence of other bosses, Barzini spoke openly about Vito's decline. "That old man sits in his garden," he mocked. "He's forgotten how to lead. The Corleone family belongs to yesterday. Tomorrow belongs to those with vision and strength." Barzini believed he had orchestrated the perfect trap. He was the puppet master. He controlled the commission. He decided who lived and who fell. He had no idea that Vito Corleone was watching, and that the old man was playing a different game entirely. The Sollozzo proposal arrived in spring of 1945, presented formally by Virgil Sollozzo, a drug trafficker seeking family protection for a massive narcotics operation. Sollozzo was polite but direct. He had already secured connections in Sicily and had the financial backing of powerful interests. He simply needed the Corleone family's political protection to expand across America. The profit margins would be extraordinary, millions flowing into the family coffers each year. All he asked was the Corleone name and their judicial connections. Vito listened carefully in his office, his consigliere, Tom Hogan, sitting beside him taking notes. When Sollozzo finished his presentation, Vito's answer was immediate and absolute. "No, we don't do the drug business." Vito explained his reasoning with the patience of a man who had explained this principle 1,000 times. Drugs destroyed communities. Drugs brought federal attention. Drugs bred violence among dealers fighting for territory. It was a business model that guaranteed only chaos and imprisonment. The Corleone family did not engage in narcotics. This decision was final. Sollozzo left the meeting appearing calm, but Barzini already knew this would be Vito's response. That rejection was precisely the catalyst Barzini needed. Within days, Barzini made his move. He allied with Philip Tattaglia, a rival boss, and they secretly backed Sollozzo's next attempt. This time, Sollozzo approached the Tattaglias with the same proposal. When they agreed to distribute narcotics through Tattaglia family channels, Barzini's strategy became clear. Isolate the Corleones by giving the Tattaglias a lucrative monopoly on drug distribution. The other families would grow rich from narcotics while the Corleones' refusal to participate meant lost revenues and diminished power. But Barzini wanted more than just financial advantage. He wanted Vito Corleone eliminated. On the evening of June 1st, 1945, Vito was leaving his office after conducting family business. He stepped onto the street in front of his building when two assassins emerged from a parked car. Multiple gunshots rang out. Vito collapsed on the pavement, his body bleeding severely. The hitmen fled into traffic. Vito was rushed to the hospital. his condition critical for days. The doctors weren't certain he would survive. Barzini heard the news and smiled. The old man was finished. Whether Vito lived or died, he would be removed from power for months, perhaps forever. And with Vito incapacitated, his hot-headed oldest son Sonny would take over family operations. Sonny was emotional, reactive, prone to making decisions based on rage rather than strategy. Barzini had carefully studied the Corleone family structure. He knew exactly how Sonny would respond. When Sonny learned his father had been shot, rage consumed him. He demanded immediate retaliation against the Tattaglias. Tom Hagen, the family's consigliere, urged caution. "We need to think this through," Tom counseled. "Let's wait until your father recovers. Let's talk before we act." But Sonny wasn't listening to reason. Within hours, he ordered hits on Tattaglia family members. The streets of New York erupted into open warfare. Barzini watched from the shadows as the plan unfolded perfectly. Sonny's emotional leadership was exactly what he had anticipated. The Corleone family was fracturing from within, tearing itself apart through reactive violence. The other families, seeing the Corleones weakened and fighting among themselves, began shifting their allegiances to Barzini's coalition. The power structure was realigning in real time, and Barzini was consolidating control of the commission. Months passed. Vito recovered slowly from his injuries, still weak and moving carefully through his home. Barzini made sure word spread throughout the underworld. The old man is finished. The Corleone dynasty is ending. The future belongs to those with vision and strength. When Vito finally returned to limited family duties, he was a shadow of his former self, or so it appeared. He attended commission meetings, listened to proposals, and said little. He seemed defeated, his authority eroded by months of incapacity. Barzini believed he had won. The Corleone family was on the verge of collapse. Sonny was reckless and unpredictable. Young Michael was exiled in Sicily. The other sons were weak, and Vito, the patriarch who had ruled for so long, was finally too old and too broken to stop what was coming. Barzini had no idea that every moment of apparent weakness was calculated. Vito was watching. Vito was remembering. And Vito was preparing his response. By autumn of 1945, months had passed since Sonny's death. The Corleone family was bleeding money and members. Barzini's coalition controlled most of New York's underworld. In the hospitals and streets, word spread that the Corleone empire was finished. The old man was too weak to recover. Michael was in Sicily. The organization was crumbling. Barzini had won the war without firing another shot. But Vito Corleone was not finished. He was simply observing. From his home, still moving slowly, but with growing strength, Vito received reports from his remaining loyal associates. He heard about every meeting between the Tattaglias and the other families. He learned which bosses were accepting money from Barzini to weaken Corleone interests. He understood the network of alliances that had formed against him, and he noted something crucial. Certain decisions showed patterns of tactical sophistication that Tattaglia alone could not orchestrate. The strategy was too refined. The timing was too precise. The coordination was too perfectly executed. Tattaglia was the visible face of the coalition, but someone else was directing the orchestra. Vito studied the war like a chess master studying an opponent's moves. He analyzed every assassination, every territory lost, every business seized. The moves were calculated. They were layered. They were designed to maximize pressure on Corleone interests while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business disputes. This was not Tattaglia's crude style. This was the work of someone with superior intelligence, someone patient, someone who thought in terms of long-term strategy rather than immediate victory. Vito came to a conclusion. Don Barzini was the true enemy, not Tattaglia, not Sollozzo. Barzini. By December 1945, Vito had recovered enough strength to resume his position. He began secret negotiations with the other families, not to surrender, but to arrange a peace conference. He sent word through trusted intermediaries. Don Vito Corleone, requests a meeting of the Five Families Commission. He wishes to discuss terms of peace. The message was delivered with formal respect, using the traditional protocols of organized crime diplomacy. Barzini received the message and smiled. Here was the old man, broken and weakened, finally coming to heal. The meeting would be Vito's surrender. Barzini would dictate terms. The Corleones would accept them. The war would end with the Corleone family permanently reduced in status and power. Barzini had orchestrated the perfect victory. He had no idea that Vito was planning something entirely different. On the day of the Five Families meeting, the five most powerful crime bosses in New York sat in a neutral location to negotiate. Vito entered walking slowly, still bearing the visible marks of his gunshot wounds. He moved carefully, like a man in pain, like a man whose strength had been permanently diminished. Barzini watched him approach and felt the satisfaction of complete victory. Vito opened the meeting with a formal proposal. He wanted peace. He was willing to accept reasonable terms. He was willing to allow the other families to expand their operations into territories that had previously been Corleone-controlled. He was willing to step back from several business ventures. He spoke with the tone of a man accepting defeat with dignity, acknowledging that his time of dominance was ending. Then Vito made his crucial move. He proposed that one of the families should receive exclusive control over drug distribution throughout New York. This was the prize that Barzini had fought for. This was the territory that would generate extraordinary profits. Vito said he was willing to accept this arrangement, that he would bless whichever family the commission designated as the drug trafficking authority. The response revealed everything. Tattaglia nodded but said little. The Quenzas appeared indifferent. The San Clementis had no strong opinion, but Barzini responded with sudden intensity. He began explaining why the drug distribution rights were so important. He detailed the profit projections. He discussed the political connections required. He explained the logistics of international narcotics trade. He advocated passionately, pushing hard for the Barzini family to receive exclusive control. Vito watched every word. He observed Tattaglia, looking to Barzini for guidance. He noticed the other bosses waiting to see what Barzini would say before expressing their own positions. The pattern was unmistakable. Tattaglia was following Barzini's lead. Barzini was directing the entire coalition. Barzini was the mastermind, not the obvious Tattaglia. In that moment, Vito Corleone knew with absolute certainty. Barzini had orchestrated the entire war. Barzini had arranged for the Sollozzo proposal. Barzini had approved the attempt on his life. Barzini had guided Sonny into the trap that led to his death. Barzini had coordinated the coalition of families. Barzini had believed he was the puppet master, manipulating the entire criminal empire. But now Vito understood the complete picture, and Barzini still believed he was winning. Barzini still thought Vito was broken. Barzini had no idea that the old man had been observing, calculating, planning. Barzini had no idea that Vito had identified him as the true enemy. And Barzini had no idea that Vito was about to teach him the most important lesson of his life. Never underestimate a patient enemy. Vito agreed to the terms. He accepted defeat with formal dignity. He embraced peace with respect for the commission. He agreed that Barzini's family would receive the drug distribution rights. And as Vito walked out of the meeting, he was already planning how every one of these families would answer for what they had done. For months after the peace agreement, Barzini watched the Corleone family appear to accept their diminished status. Vito moved slowly through his offices and his home, now truly looking like an old man broken by war. Michael had returned from Sicily and was living quietly in Nevada, away from the criminal underworld. Fredo was managing some family interests, but without power or influence. The Corleone organization seemed to be fading into irrelevance, their territories shrinking, their influence diminishing. Barzini's coalition grew bolder with each passing week. But behind the scenes, Vito Corleone was orchestrating the most sophisticated operation of his life. First, Vito rebuilt his network of loyal soldiers. He identified which capo regimes had remained faithful during the war, and he rewarded them generously. He also studied which of Barzini's and Tattaglia's men were dissatisfied, underpaid, or growing restless in their positions. Through intermediaries, Vito had conversations with these men. He offered them respect, higher percentages of profits, and most importantly, he offered them the promise that the Corleone family would survive and thrive again, while their current bosses were vulnerable. Key figures began to shift. Some of Barzini's own lieutenants started reporting information back to Vito through secret channels. Vito learned about Barzini's movements, his business dealings, his relationships with the other families. He understood who among Barzini's coalition was loyal and who was simply aligned out of fear or temporary advantage. Vito was preparing an intelligence network that would become invaluable. Second, Vito took direct action against the encroachment on Corleone territory. He instructed his capo regimes to quietly begin reclaiming bookmaking operations, loan sharking businesses, and gambling rackets that had been seized during the war. But he told them to do it gradually, carefully, without obvious violence or confrontation. A Barzini bookmaker would find his operation mysteriously having difficulty. A Tattaglia loan shark would discover that his debtors were refusing to pay. A Quenzo gambling operation would find that customers were disappearing. The pressure was subtle but relentless. Third, Vito began positioning his younger son Michael for leadership. He called Michael back from Nevada and assigned him to sit in on family business meetings. Michael was intelligent, strategic, and most importantly, he had no baggage from the previous war. The other families did not yet fear Michael. Michael was a blank canvas, and Vito was preparing to use him as his instrument of precision. Vito and Michael had long conversations in the garden where Vito tended his roses and tomato plants. Vito explained how power worked in their world. He explained how enemies would approach with peace proposals. He explained how to identify traitors. They would be the ones offering the peace meetings. He explained patience. He explained how the strongest position was often the one that appeared weak. Never show strength when weakness serves you better, Vito told his son. Let them think they have won. Let them grow confident. That is when they make mistakes. By 1950, 5 years after the attempted hit on his life, Vito had quietly rebuilt the Corleone family's position. The losses remained visible on the surface. They controlled fewer territories than before. Their businesses appeared reduced in scope, but underneath, the infrastructure was being reconstructed with precision. Vito's network of informants penetrated every major family's operations. His loyal soldiers occupied key positions throughout New York's underworld. His financial operations, hidden through shell companies and front businesses, were generating enormous profits that Barzini's coalition never suspected existed. Most importantly, Vito had identified his moment. Barzini was growing complacent. The Tattaglia family was arguing internally about succession and power. The other families in the coalition were beginning to suspect each other, wondering if they had given up too much in the war. The alliance that had seemed so strong was beginning to fracture from within. Vito made a calculated decision. He approached Salvatore Tessio, one of his most trusted capo regimes, with an assignment. I need you to let it be known through the proper channels that you have been approached by a representative of Don Barzini. Tell them that Barzini has approached you with a peace proposal for me. Tell them that Barzini wishes to discuss a new arrangement where I retire completely from the family business, allowing my son to take over. Tell them that Barzini promises safety and respect to our family if I step aside. Tessio was confused by the order, but he followed it precisely. Word spread through the underworld. Don Barzini was ready to make peace with the aging Vito Corleone. Barzini was offering the old man a dignified retirement in exchange for the transfer of power to the younger generation. It seemed like a reasonable proposal. It seemed like a moment of final victory for Barzini's coalition. Vito knew that Barzini would take the bait. He knew that an old rival offering to step aside without a fight would seem too good to be true, but that such an opportunity would be impossible to resist. Barzini would believe that his patience and strategy had finally defeated the Corleone Empire. He would make his final move, believing himself to be the victor in a long game. And when Barzini made that move, Vito would be waiting. Years of patience had prepared this moment. Every piece was now positioned on the board, the trap was set, and the master orchestrator had no idea he was walking directly into it. Salvatore Tessio came to Michael Corleone with the proposal exactly as Vito had predicted. Tessio was one of Michael's father's oldest and most trusted capo regimes, but he had secretly been working for Barzini for months, slowly providing information that helped orchestrate the war against the Corleone family. Now Tessio approached Michael with deference and apparent concern. "Don Michael, I have been approached by representatives of Don Barzini. He wishes to meet with you to discuss peace terms. He says the families are willing to end this conflict if you will agree to certain conditions. Don Barzini promises your safety and the family's future if you come to this meeting." Michael listened carefully and thanked Tessio for bringing him the message. He said he would consider the proposal. But inside, Michael understood exactly what was happening. Before his father's death, Vito had called Michael to his bedside and given him the most important warning of his life. Vito explained how enemies would always approach with peace proposals when they sensed weakness. "When they come to you with these offers of peace, the one who brings you the proposal is the traitor," Vito had said. "Never trust a peace meeting, it is always a trap." Michael now understood that Tessio, loyal Salvatore Tessio, the man he had known his entire life, was the traitor. Which meant Barzini had been orchestrating the entire war all along. Barzini had positioned himself perfectly to strike. He had convinced the other families to attack. He had weakened the Corleones, and now, when the family appeared vulnerable without Vito's leadership, Barzini was moving in for the final blow. But Michael had one crucial advantage. His father had taught him how to think. Michael understood that Barzini had already made a fatal error by revealing himself through Tessio's approach. The trap was now inverted. Instead of Michael walking into Barzini's ambush, Barzini was walking directly into Michael's. Michael informed his consigliere Tom Hogan that he would accept Barzini's peace proposal. He gave specific instructions. He asked that the meeting be arranged in a neutral location, a restaurant in Manhattan, the kind of place where business could be conducted with apparent legitimacy. Michael instructed that the other family's leaders also be present: Don Tattaglia, Don Cuneo, Don Stracci. If this was truly a peace meeting for all the families, everyone should attend. Barzini received word that Michael Corleone had accepted the proposal. The orchestrator smiled. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. The young Corleone, new to power and untested, was walking directly into the carefully prepared ambush. Barzini had stationed his best assassins throughout Manhattan. He had positioned men at the restaurant. He had coordinated with Tattaglia's family. When Michael arrived for the meeting, Barzini would have him eliminated, along with any remaining Corleone leadership. The family would fracture. Their territories would be divided among the coalition families. Barzini would consolidate power and emerge as the supreme boss of New York organized crime. What Barzini didn't know was that Michael Corleone had already positioned his own men throughout the city. Michael had identified every location where Barzini's assassins were hiding. Michael had coordinated with Peter Clemenza and Sal Lampone, two of his father's most loyal capo regimes. Michael had prepared for this moment with the precision of a chess master. The peace meeting never took place. Instead, on the day that was supposed to be Michael's death, Barzini received word that Michael was attending the baptism of his nephew at a Manhattan church. At the same moment, Michael received confirmation that all 5 family bosses were exposed and vulnerable. The moment had arrived. Outside the New York Supreme Court building at Foley Square, Don Emilio Barzini emerged from a hearing surrounded by his bodyguards. He had been conducting seemingly legitimate business, appearing confident, believing his plans were proceeding perfectly. As he walked down the courthouse steps, a man dressed as a police officer approached. The officer appeared to be writing a parking ticket for Barzini's car. When Barzini came close, the officer revealed himself as Michael's personal enforcer, Al Neri. Neri's gun appeared and fired without hesitation. Barzini's bodyguards fell. Then Neri turned his weapon on Barzini himself, shooting twice in the back as Barzini attempted to flee. The orchestrator tumbled down the courthouse steps, his body finally coming to rest on the cold concrete below. Barzini was dead, eliminated in a public location where everyone could eventually learn what had happened. At the same moment, across the city, other assassins were eliminating the other dons who had conspired against the Corleone family. The coordinated strikes happened simultaneously, Barzini at the courthouse, Tattaglia in his home, the others at predetermined locations. Within hours, the leadership of every family that had participated in the war against the Corleones was eliminated. Barzini had believed he was the puppet master, orchestrating the final move in his game. He had no idea that Vito Corleone, even in death, had positioned every piece on the board. Barzini had no idea that the young Michael Corleone had studied every aspect of his plan and inverted it completely. Barzini had believed he was winning when he was actually walking directly into the trap that Vito had predicted and Michael had constructed. The puppet master had become the puppet. The orchestrator had been orchestrated. Within 48 hours of Barzini's death, the crime families of New York understood what had happened. The simultaneous elimination of all 5 major bosses who had participated in the war against the Corleones was not a coincidence. It was a coordinated statement. It was organized, methodical, devastating proof that someone had orchestrated the entire sequence with precision. And that someone was the Corleone family. But more specifically, it was Michael Corleone. The remaining families held emergency meetings in hidden locations throughout New York. They replayed the previous decade in their minds, searching for the moment when they had misunderstood what was actually happening. The moment when they had believed one narrative, when a completely different narrative was unfolding beneath the surface. The realization struck them gradually, then suddenly all at once. Vito Corleone had been orchestrating the entire game from the moment he recovered from his gunshot wounds. Every apparent weakness was strategic. Every moment of vulnerability was calculated. Every defeat was actually a sacrifice that served a larger purpose. The 5 years of apparent Corleone decline had been cover for an intelligence operation and power consolidation that no one had recognized until it was too late. Vito had identified Barzini as the true orchestrator of the war because Barzini had made a critical mistake. He had been too obvious about his ambitions at the commission meeting. Barzini's passionate advocacy for the drug distribution rights had revealed his position as the coalition's true leader. And once Vito identified Barzini, everything else became clear. But the families had no way to attack Vito because Vito had already died by the time the coordinated strikes occurred. Vito died peacefully in his garden, playing with his grandson, having completed his plan and passed leadership to Michael. By the time Barzini was eliminated on the courthouse steps, Vito Corleone had already been dead for nearly a week, confirmed to have died of a heart attack while tending to his tomato plants. The other families could not respond to Vito's aggression because Vito was no longer alive to strike back at. Michael, now the official leader of the Corleone family, was untouchable. He had inherited a consolidated position of absolute power. The intelligence networks his father had built remained intact. The loyal soldiers his father had cultivated remained loyal to the Corleone family. The financial infrastructure remained hidden from law enforcement and rival families. Michael established himself as the undisputed supreme boss of New York organized crime. The remaining families, those who hadn't been eliminated, approached Michael with respect and submission. They recognized that they were dealing with not just a criminal boss, but with a family that had proven its strategic superiority. The families that had plotted against the Corleones had been dismantled. Their territories were divided among the surviving families according to Michael's distribution. Their businesses were either absorbed or eliminated. In the months that followed, Michael began transforming the Corleone family's operations. He moved the headquarters to Las Vegas, away from the East Coast battlegrounds where the war had been fought. He began the long process of legitimizing family businesses through legal enterprises and investments. He married Kay Adams, making official his commitment to building a new generation of Corleones who would inherit a partially legitimate empire. But the most important legacy was psychological. The remaining crime bosses understood that they had been played at every level by Vito Corleone and his son Michael. Barzini had believed himself to be the puppet master orchestrating a criminal war, when in reality Barzini had been the puppet being orchestrated by a far superior intelligence. Barzini had thought he was winning when he was actually walking through every move that Vito had predicted and Michael had prepared for. The families whispered about how Vito had allowed Barzini to believe he was winning for 5 years. They discussed how Michael had positioned himself as the perfect trap. They understood that patience, the willingness to appear weak, the willingness to accept temporary losses, the willingness to observe and plan over years rather than weeks, had been the ultimate weapon. No military force could match it. No alliance could overcome it. No strategy could counter it. Vito Corleone had died as a victor without firing a shot in his own defense. He had orchestrated his own death strategically, ensuring that Michael would inherit a position of undisputed power with all remaining threats eliminated. And Michael, trained by his father in the art of patience and intelligence, proved himself worthy of that inheritance by executing his father's final plan with precision and ruthlessness. The message was clear to every crime family in America. Never underestimate the Corleones. The family that appears weak may be the family that is most dangerous. The leader who seems defeated may be the leader who is orchestrating your destruction. And patience, strategy, and intelligence, not speed or aggression, determine power in organized crime. Barzini had orchestrated a war, believing he would emerge victorious. Instead, he had merely been the actor speaking lines that Vito Corleone had written for him, playing a role in a drama that ended with his elimination and the consolidation of Corleone supremacy over all of New York organized crime. In the weeks following the coordinated strikes that eliminated the five families' leadership, a profound realization swept through organized crime's upper ranks. The bosses, capo regimes, and soldiers throughout New York began understanding what had actually occurred over the previous decade. They studied the timeline, they analyzed the decisions, they traced the invisible threads that connected every event from Vito's shooting in 1945 to Barzini's death on the courthouse steps. The clarity was devastating. Barzini had been played, not defeated, not outmaneuvered in a single moment, but orchestrated through an entire decade with the precision of a master conductor directing a symphony. Every move Barzini had made, every decision he believed was his own strategic brilliance, had been anticipated and positioned into place by Vito Corleone. Barzini had thought he was the maestro. In reality, he had been the instrument. Consider what had actually happened. Barzini had organized the Sollozzo proposal to force Vito into a situation where either he refused and appeared weak, or he accepted the drug trade and compromised his principles. Either outcome weakened Vito's position, but Vito had refused and used that refusal as cover to identify his enemies. Barzini had arranged the assassination attempt on Vito, believing it would remove his most dangerous opponent. Instead, Vito had used those weeks of recovery to study every family's movements and identify Barzini as the true orchestrator. Barzini had provoked Sonny into reckless decisions, confident that destroying Sonny would fracture the Corleone family, and it had. But while Sonny was dying in the streets of New York, Vito was quietly building an intelligence network that would eventually eliminate everyone who had participated in the conspiracy. The genius of Vito's approach was that he had not rushed, he had not panicked, he had not made emotional decisions based on rage or the desire for immediate vengeance. Instead, Vito had observed, learned, calculated, and waited. He had allowed Barzini to believe he was winning for 5 full years. He had let Barzini's confidence grow. He had positioned his son Michael as a blank canvas, someone the other families did not yet fear. And when the moment arrived, Vito had orchestrated simultaneous strikes against every family that had conspired against him, then died peacefully in his garden before any of them could even contemplate retaliation. The families understood that this was not just a military victory. This was a demonstration of absolute intellectual superiority. The Barzini coalition had been destroyed not because they were weak soldiers or poor strategists individually. They had been destroyed because Vito Corleone was operating at a level of strategic sophistication they could not comprehend, could not match, and could not predict. Michael inherited a consolidated position of power that was virtually unassailable. The remaining crime families approached him with deference and submission. They knew that they were dealing with someone who had proven himself even more brilliant than his father. Michael had sat quietly, observed everything, learned the complete structure of organized crime's power dynamics, and then executed his father's final plan with perfect precision. He was young, intelligent, ruthless, and most importantly, he had demonstrated that he could think 10 steps ahead of his enemies. Michael began the process of moving the Corleone family to Las Vegas, establishing legitimate casino operations, while maintaining the family's criminal enterprises through Clemenza and other loyal capo regimes in New York. Michael's promise to Kay was that the Corleone family would become completely legitimate within 5 years. He meant it. He would build legitimate businesses, invest in legal enterprises, and establish a dynasty that future generations could inherit without the burden of constant warfare and danger. But the lesson was already clear to organized crime structure. Patience defeats aggression. Intelligence defeats muscle. Strategy defeats impulse. The families that survived understood that the Corleone philosophy, the willingness to appear weak, the ability to observe and learn rather than immediately react, the confidence to wait years for the perfect moment, was the most powerful approach to power in organized crime. Barzini, had he lived to understand what actually happened, would have experienced the ultimate humiliation. He would have learned that every move he believed was his own orchestration had been predicted and countered by Vito Corleone. He would have realized that Vito had been playing him like a chess opponent plays an inferior player, allowing the opponent to believe he is making strategic decisions, when in reality every move has been anticipated and positioned into a larger trap. Barzini would have understood that the puppet master was actually the puppet, and that Vito Corleone had orchestrated not just Barzini's death, but the destruction of everyone Barzini had allied with, and everything Barzini had built. The ultimate irony was perfect. The man who mocked Vito as a weak old man had been completely and systematically destroyed by that old man's intelligence. The orchestrator had become the orchestrated, and the lesson echoed through organized crime for generations. Never underestimate a patient enemy who is willing to lose battles in order to win the war. Never mistake quiet observation for weakness. Never assume that your enemies are actually the enemies you see. The true orchestrator is always working behind the scenes, positioning pieces on a board you don't even know exists. Michael Corleone now sat at the top of organized crime's hierarchy, positioned to build a dynasty that his father had envisioned. And every remaining crime boss knew that Michael had learned the ultimate lesson from his father. Patience, intelligence, and strategy were more powerful than any weapon ever manufactured.